The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's NITC webinar on Aiming for Walkable Inclusive Communities. My name is Lisa Patterson, and I will be your moderator for today. I am the Tech Transfer and Workforce Development Program Manager for TREC, the Transportation Research Education Center at Portland State University. TREC houses NITC, the National Institute for Transportation and Communities. NITC is the federally designated National University Transportation Center for Livable Communities and is a Portland State-led partnership with the University of Oregon, Oregon Institute of Technology, University of Utah, University of Arizona, and University of Texas at Arlington. Our webinars are based on original research conducted by faculty, researchers, and students at NITC partner universities. The goal of these webinars is to get useful research results into the hands of practitioners, academics, and other stakeholders. Our speaker today is Dr. Arlie Adkins from the University of Arizona. Arlie is an assistant professor of urban planning in the School of Landscape Architecture and Planning at the University of Arizona. His research focuses on understanding relationships between transportation, urban design, public health, and social equity. He has a PhD from Portland State University and a master's degree in city planning from UC Berkeley. He is currently the lead researcher on a multi-year CDC-funded project investigating barriers to active transportation and perceptions of walkability in Latino neighborhoods in Pima County, Arizona. This research is currently being expanded to other cities through a grant from NITC. Other research includes an ongoing national investigation of location efficiency within two of the largest federal affordable housing programs in the U.S., and experimental research on racial bias in driving yielding to pedestrians at crosswalks. Before his academic career, Arlie worked for TriMet, the transit agency in Portland, Oregon, and at FlexCar, a pioneer of car sharing in North America. All right, before diving into the webinar, I'd like to let you know about a couple upcoming webinars and related trainings. On June 11th, Roger Lindgren from Oregon Institute of Technology will present on his education research project, Firsthand Data Collection, Students Get Behind the Wheel of Vehicle Dynamics. And on August 9th, Sharon Barbeau from the University of South Florida and MOVL are presenting on how to overcome barriers to wide-scale adoption of standardized real-time transit information. And one more webinar that's not on the screen, but we are also hosting a partner webinar with the Oregon APA on authentic community engagement with Aaron Key from Metro and Wendy Serrano from TriMet. And lastly, one other upcoming event we are hosting is our annual Transportation and Communities Conference. This year we're trying something a little different. Instead of our brief sessions that introduce you to a topic, we'll be offering 15 half-day workshops that will be hands-on and provide some deep dive training in a small classroom setting. Here are a few highlighted workshops that we'll be offering, but you also will be able to see the full agenda soon on our website under events, and registration will be open soon as well. On our website, there is a link to sign up to be notified when registration opens. All right, and before I hand it over to Arlie, I'll give you a brief overview of the webinar. Arlie will present for about 40 minutes. During this time, you can submit questions, which will be answered at the end of the webinar. We also will be recording today's webinar and we'll make it available on our website. You will receive the video recording and presentation slides in an email following the webinar in the next day or two. If you're tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. Instructions on how to redeem the credit will also be included in the post-webinar email. During the presentation, you may submit questions for Arlie by using the questions pane on your control panel. We will track the questions and Arlie will respond to them at the end of the webinar. If we run out of time, we will send out written responses for any questions left unanswered. And with that, I will hand it over to Arlie.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful to be here talking to you all, at least virtually. So as you heard, my name is Arlie Adkins. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. And I am glad to be here talking to you today about some of the work that I have been doing that I hope can shed some light on how we as planners and other transportation professionals can better plan for walkable and inclusive communities.
Hey, Arlie, sorry to interrupt. Just want to let you know that you're showing your presenter screen.
Okay, it switched again. Okay, let's swap. All right, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so before I get going, I really want to thank the funders of this work. As Lisa mentioned, this is a multi-year project that I'll be talking about today. That was the first phases were funded by the CDC's Physical Activity Policy Research Network, and then the expansion of the work, which is ongoing, was funded by NITC, the National Institute for Transportation and Communities. So I'm really excited to be able to share the work that we have accomplished to date, as well as some of the next steps that we really hope will be particularly helpful for people out there, both in practice and research. I'd also like to thank some of my collaborators on this work. So Maya Ingram, one of my key collaborators who is in the faculty in the College of Public Health, and then Nicola Rosalardo, who is also now at the University of Arizona, and a team of amazing grad students that, as you'll see, this work has been fairly time intensive in terms of actually being out in communities talking to people, and I've had an amazing team of graduate students who have been helping in that. Also, Living Streets Alliance, which is a local advocacy organization in the Tucson area, has been our community partner for much of this work, and really instrumental in helping us develop some of our strategies for engaging with communities and incorporating those efforts into our research. So to begin, I want to take a look at this picture and talk through a couple of things here. So this is in Tucson, Arizona, where our work, most of our work has been focused over the last several years. And this, as you can tell, is just a Google Street View image. And I actually saw this picture before I had ever been down here to South 12th Avenue in Tucson. So this is an area that is about 80% Hispanic Latino, fairly high rates of poverty, fairly low income. And as you can see, there's a lot to be desired in terms of the walkability of this area. And when I pulled this picture up, doing some online reconnaissance before going out to visit this site, I was really struck by the kind of the starkness of this image, and focusing in on the guy there you see walking along, not on the sidewalk because there is no sidewalk here, but walking along this fairly busy road, kind of looking back at the Google camera, maybe wondering a little bit what's going on. But I really focus on this picture because what we're really trying to do with this work is understand from the perspective of this guy here standing there as an example, what makes a community walkable from the perspective of the people who are living in it. And so that this picture really has become emblematic of that effort, and really trying to understand and talk to people like this man that we see here out in the community. So backing up a little bit, looks like PowerPoint is restarting. Apologies. Let's try that again. I think I'll need to swap. Okay, so backing up, and this is going to be a review for a lot of you. I'm sure you are well aware of many of these, but why we need inclusive walkable communities. One, we have tremendous evidence of health benefits of being in neighborhoods that are walkable, being able to meet many of our daily travel needs through walking, increases physical activity, which has been shown to reduce many health problems, especially if you look from childhood through older adults. We also see many safety disparities for pedestrians. In Tucson, as an example, if we look in the lower income census tracts, which the picture that you just saw would be in one of those, the pedestrian fatality rate is about 3 times what it is in some of the higher income parts of town. We also have many environmental benefits that we're all quite aware of, getting people out of cars using modes of transportation that are not going to be as polluting has benefits both at the neighborhood level and globally. We see social benefits. When people get out and are walking around their neighborhood, they're engaging with neighbors, they're less socially isolated. And again, these benefits, we see them from children through adults and then as people age into older adulthood. We also see economic benefits. It's very expensive to own and operate a car. And when we give people options of being able to walk in their communities, maybe not for all of their trips, but it can cut down significantly on the cost of transportation. And I think one thing that's important to remember is that inclusive communities need walkability. I think you'd be hard pressed to convince me that we could have a truly inclusive community that did not have elements of walkability included, just because of all of these benefits above. But sadly, often the reverse is not true, and we do see communities that are being developed as walkable communities that lack that inclusivity piece. So another background, some of you may be aware of social ecological models, which planners are increasingly borrowing from public health. But it's basically this idea that when we're talking about people's behavior, including transportation behavior, we have to be thinking at these different levels of the environment. So intrapersonal, so characteristics of the person, attitudes of the person. Then we go to interpersonal, where we're talking about family relationships, things like that, social relationships. And then we talk about the environment setting, which often in the work that I do is looking at neighborhood, that neighborhood context, sometimes built environment, the setting where that behavior is taking place. And then we have all kinds of community level factors that will determine whether or not someone is doing a particular behavior. And then finally, we have the policy level, which many of us think about on a regular basis, and how policies can affect the ways that people choose to get around. And one of the key elements of these social ecological models is that in order to effectively influence behavior, we need to be operating at multiple levels. So we need to not just be thinking at that environment or that behavior setting level, but we need to be thinking about interactions between how someone's individual characteristics, or how their family status, or how their socioeconomic status, or how their the shape and feel of their community, how all of those things are interacting with each other. And then of course at the policy level, policy changes, or the impact of those is going to vary depending on each of these other levels. So a lot of the work that I'm doing and a lot of other people are doing are really trying to understand the interactions between these different environment levels based on the social ecological model. So when we're looking at planning for walkable communities, I think it's helpful to recognize that there are really two things that we're trying to do. One is improving walkability, or I like to say walking environments, because walkability can mean so many different things, but improving walking environments for those already walking. And then we're also trying to get more people walking. And the distinction here may not seem that great. And in fact, the ways that we achieve both of these things are often quite similar, but there are some real important differences in how we talk about these things. So where these two come together, I like to argue, is really where we are supporting existing communities. And I'll explain a little bit why that is in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about some of the elements that go into specifically improving walking environments for those who are already walking. So we talk about things like safety, comfort, dignity. So making sure that we are giving people walking environments where they can be walking in a dignified way, where they feel good about that decision, or sometimes not the decision, just that they have to be out there walking, where we're increasing efficiency so that people are having time to do the other things in their lives, they're able to access the things that they need. So connectivity is related to that. Also, we want to be increasing security so people feel safe when they're out walking. They're not getting mugged or fearful that they are going to be getting mugged. And there's some real time of day considerations here. And then also we're increasing health. And health here for those who are already walking can be not so much about the physical activity component, but about exposure to different pollutants that might be out there. So there are various things that I'm sure many of you work on that can increase all of these different elements for those who are already walking. And you'll notice that a lot of these things also have the benefit of probably getting more people to walk. So we do have evidence that increasing environments for those who are already walking will have that secondary benefit of getting more people walking. And the reason that I focus on this is that I think it's really important in how we talk about improving walkability in neighborhoods. So when we look at getting more people walking, we're often talking about behavior change. So we are trying to, get people, maybe getting them out of their cars, or just getting people who are currently having a fairly sedentary lifestyle, getting them out of their house and walking around their neighborhoods. And that's a great thing. But sometimes what we see more of, again, because it's very difficult to change someone's behavior, especially through when we're not thinking on those different levels of the social ecological model, when, for example, we're just focusing on behavior change, it's very difficult to actually change someone's behavior. So what we sometimes see, and we're seeing this in cities around the country, we improve the walking environment, and rather than behavior change, we're seeing people change. And what I mean by that is we are seeing those built environment improvements, improving the walking environment, but improving it for future residents. We're seeing, and of course this is tied very closely with economic pressures that are leading to economic displacement and gentrification. And we're going to continue to see that as we have walkable neighborhoods being viewed as an amenity that people are willing to pay for. So again, this is largely about how we're talking about these things. I like to say that we need to be using a choice rather than a change framework. And for urban planners, one of the ways this is very much embedded in our code of ethics, though I think we often fall short here. But here you can see from the American Institute of Certified Planners Code of Ethics, one of those things that we are to strive for is to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, and especially recognizing the responsibility to plan for the needs of disadvantaged groups and persons. So there, that expansion of choice. So what this means is that we're not just going into communities and saying, you all need to be walking more, you all need to be more physically active. We're going to give you the tools to do that, but we need to be making sure that we are talking about this as choices, as healthy, economic choices that people can be making, and we're giving them the tools to do that. Of course, one of the things that we need to be thinking about there, and it's kind of another research project that I'm not talking about much today, is looking at the connections between affordable housing and walkable neighborhoods. And if we are creating neighborhoods that are walkable but only affordable to a narrow subset of the population, we're not making truly walkable neighborhoods. And the same would go for transit-friendly or bikeable neighborhoods as well. So one of the things that this subtle change of focusing our attention on the existing users of the system, so the pedestrians, is that we're explicitly valuing the experiences and expertise of the real experts who are the people that are out walking in your community. So if you think back to that picture that we started with, valuing the experiences of that guy that we saw walking on the street and what he has to say about walking. And that is really the premise for this multi-year research project that I'm going to be talking with you about today. As I mentioned, this is work that started out in Tucson, but thanks to a grant from NITC, we've been able to expand this to multiple cities. So it was initially a 5-year grant from the CDC, and we're just wrapping up year 4 So we've got one more year to go. And this just gives you a sense of what we have been up to and what we plan to do going forward. And highlighted in pink here is what I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about our research findings today. So we started out with a systematic lit review to really understand what has been written on this particular topic about understanding walkability in different neighborhood contexts. We really wanted to approach this from taking a step back from our assumptions about what walkability and what walkable neighborhoods mean. So we, went out and wanted to talk to people. So we talked to people through a series of focus groups, and then we've been conducting on-street interviews. We started out doing those in Tucson, and I'll get into a little bit sort of why we chose that method in a minute. But those on-street interviews are something. We got about 200 of those in Tucson, and we have expanded to additional cities. We then have run those interview and focus group findings by decision makers locally and regionally in Tucson. We've then used those conversations to further refine the tool to make them useful to decision makers. And then we are currently we are deploying this approach in different cities. So we just had data collection mostly complete in Los Angeles, Orange County, and Denver. So we have between those three areas an additional 500 or so on-street interviews that we're going to be going over to try to better understand the specific neighborhood context in those neighborhoods where we were working. So briefly, that systematic review, so this was published in the Journal of the American Planning Association probably about 9 months ago. So the question here was, do relationships between built environments and walking vary by socioeconomic context? So we have a tremendous amount of evidence out there on the research side that built environments make it more likely, or supportive built environment for walking will make it more likely that someone will walk. And we wanted to understand if that is true across the board, or more likely, or more true in some socioeconomic contexts than others. So we looked at public health and planning literature, and what we found was pretty clear evidence that standard measures of walkability have been largely defined and validated from a fairly white middle-class context. And there are lots of reasons for this. One of the ones that we talk about in that paper is that from the perspective of the researchers who were doing this starting in the 1990s, it was very important to understand and try to make the case to decision makers that walkable environments were having an impact. So what we saw with a lot of this research was efforts to control for things like income and things like race, but not to really understand the role that those socioeconomic and sociocultural and race ethnicity variables had on whether or not these relationships were true. So we also saw studies that were designed to sort of preemptively control for differences in income and in race and ethnicity. So we saw studies that would specifically choose neighborhoods that didn't vary very much in those characteristics, so that the effect of the built environment could be isolated as much as possible. So we missed out on a lot of detail from this work, and certainly others have been following and trying to do more of this, and those were the papers that we were able to pull together to look at some of these relationships. So what we saw from the studies that we reviewed was that the built environment walkability attributes, so the sort of standard things that we think about when we think about what Robert Severo called density, diversity, and design, and other attributes that we've added subsequently, we found that those are consistently more strongly correlated with walking and physical activity for relatively advantaged groups in terms of socioeconomics, in terms of education, in terms of race and ethnicity. And here, just to show you the degree to which that difference is present. If we focus down here, so this is basically summarizing the studies that allowed us to make these kind of comparisons. So we see that ratio, that built environment effect ratio, so 2.3 times stronger built environment effects for the relatively advantaged group. And each group, depending on each study, had different groups, but they were all looking at kind of this broader question of socioeconomic status. So, so the effect of a supportive built environment on walking and physical activity across these studies was more than twice as strong in the advantaged community. So we could also see from the data in these studies that there are two reasons for this. One was that there was more walking occurring in unsupportive built environments in the lower socioeconomic status areas, and that also there was less walking in the objectively supportive built environments. So the first, you would expect, that people who lack resources don't have as many choices, so they're going to be walking out of necessity in places that are not necessarily designed to be supportive for walking. But then you see the last point there is in bold, because we found more evidence actually that we're seeing less walking in places that we as planners would probably describe as being fairly walkable. So thinking back to that social ecological model, the reason we see this is that there are other elements at play here. So we have characteristics of the individual, characteristics of the neighborhood environment, specifically characteristics of the social environment that are keeping people from walking even in a place that is objectively supportive of walking. And here you can see the conceptual framework that we developed for that essentially says what I just said, so I won't walk through this. But the effect is that we have a sort of a mismatch, both due to these effects that I just described and also some of the standards that we have in our walkability metrics that have largely been developed in white middle-class neighborhoods. And all of this leads in sort of the bottom right to poorly contextualized recommendations for policy and practice, and can ultimately, we think, lead to misalignment of planner and community priorities, which I'm sure many of you have encountered in your work, and especially when we see areas that are facing pressures of economic displacement, these issues can really rise to the surface because we have, in essence, plans being made for improving walkability in ways that current residents, for other reasons, are not able to take advantage of. So, and again, because that walkability neighborhood walkability is now viewed as an amenity that people are willing to pay for, we've sort of got that doubly problematic, because we're increasing the cost for people who, for other reasons, may not be able to take advantage of some of those benefits. So now moving to our walking focus groups. So we did 5 focus groups, and these were done in predominantly Hispanic Latino neighborhoods in Tucson. So all of them had Hispanic Latino populations over 80%. We started around a table at a community center or other public space, just as you would a normal focus group. But then we moved and started walking through the neighborhood with small groups of people. So we were able to use elements of the neighborhood environment to prompt conversations and really have some very in-depth discussions about different elements, both of the built environment and the social environment, that contributed to a place being a good place for walking or not such a good place for walking. We had about 40 people in total who participated. So some of the things that we heard, so there are specific concerns about dangerous street crossings, especially for children. So these were largely locations that the people at the city were already aware of, but we were able to pinpoint some specific things that the city could take action on. So security in these neighborhoods was a very big concern. So particularly for women, concerns. We weren't talking with children, but we heard from a lot of parents who were concerned about letting their children walk, especially at night. There were a lot of concerns about lighting and fears of crime mentioned in these focus groups. We also heard a lot of people talk about the role of social cohesion, this sort of sense of community that people have in their neighborhood being part of what makes them comfortable to be out and walking, but also that walking is related to that or can help to build social cohesion. We heard people talking about neighborhood identity and a real sense of place and a sense of history in the area. We saw very clearly that climate, so in the case of Tucson, our hot, arid climate can amplify other challenges. So particularly with regard to, lack of infrastructure, lack of shade, and those sorts of things. And interestingly, we thought there was a very broad spectrum of barriers and challenges that people we talked to identified, but there tended to be a much narrower view of what the city could do. So we did ask, one of our last questions was, what can the city do to make this a more walkable place? And so these were, some the barriers, a quick list of the barriers that were mentioned in these focus groups, and you'll see a lot of them. I'm not going to read all of them, and these were kind of in the words that people put them. But then when we would ask people about what the city could do, even in situations where there was actually very little mention of sidewalks, that tended to be the answer. So people focused on what the city could do in terms of infrastructure. And I think part of this is kind of what cities are typically known for. But I think what we saw very clearly is that means that we have a lot of these barriers to walking that not necessarily that the city isn't paying attention to, but that people are not accustomed to asking necessarily the city for help with, particularly in this neighborhood context. So this misalignment we thought was an important element for the city to understand that they may be getting a fairly narrow view of what the issues are when they talk to people in this community. And this was somewhat validated when we talked to people at the city, though of course, and I'll get to this in a second, but the focus groups had a fairly narrow slice of the population that we were talking to. So back to this picture, at the end of these focus groups, we really asked ourselves, were we successful at getting a better understanding of what this sort of man on the street in this neighborhood thinks about his neighborhood in terms of walkability? And what we realized is that despite our best effort, after multiple focus groups and very sort of went to great lengths to try to reach beyond people who would typically show up at neighborhood association meetings and would already be engaged, we realized that we were not reaching the people who are just out walking, perhaps out of necessity, who may not be speaking much English, who may be from immigrant communities. We're just not getting a great cross-section of the people who are actually out using the system. So on the right before our very last focus group, we were walking, or actually I shouldn't say my grad students were out walking in this particular stretch of road, and they were handing out flyers to try to recruit people to get cast a wider net for these focus groups. They talked to a young woman who was out walking with 2 children in a stroller, who spoke very little English, who walked for all of her travel because she did not have access to a car and was not able to rely on the transit service. And she ended up coming to our last focus group. And like I said, the last question in our focus groups was, what can the city do to improve walking in this area? And her response kind of floored us, and it again convinced us that we were not anywhere near done answering this question of what walkability means from the perspective of people out walking. So she said, talk to us. And she said this in Spanish, and this is the translation, but she said, talk to us, engage us, and talk to us like you did to me when you approached me. So this was a very clear signal to us that we needed to do some more digging. So we, from this point, decided to develop a different way of going out and talking to people. So no longer the focus groups, but we developed a protocol for conducting on-street interviews. So we expanded our neighborhoods and decided that we wanted to look at both predominantly Hispanic Latino neighborhoods in Tucson, but also neighborhoods, sort of a comparison that were 75% or more non-Hispanic white neighborhoods, but had similar built environments in terms of sidewalk coverage, connectivity, walk scores, had similar poverty rates and household incomes. So we were really just trying to understand what that sociocultural difference might be in terms of what makes a walkable neighborhood or perceived to be a walkable neighborhood. So we trained our grad students and they did a tremendous amount of work and are continuing to do so. They did about 200 interviews in Tucson, 118 in the Hispanic Latino neighborhoods and 72 in the comparison neighborhoods. We asked some open-ended questions about what contributes to a place being good or not good for walking. And we really didn't want to be leading people towards physical environment or social environment. So we had questions, an open-ended question like, what are some things you like about this area as a place for walking? We got some really interesting responses. People were surprisingly willing to talk to us on the street and have fairly short but fairly in-depth conversations on some of these questions. So we talked to mostly people who, let's see, walked several times per week in the neighborhood. We saw a pretty even split depending on across the neighborhoods of why people were out walking. It's about 48% for transportation. And we saw similar overall satisfaction and safety ratings across all of the neighborhoods. So here, just to summarize, and this is looking at the percentage of these characteristics, both positive and negative characteristics, that were mentioned in these interviews. As you look at this list, lack of sidewalks, calm and quiet, lack of lighting, lack of street crossings, aesthetics, and then sidewalks mentioned again as a positive. So this list looks a lot like what we as planners focus on. The catch here is that this is the list. This is the share of mentions in the interviews in the predominantly non-Hispanic white neighborhoods. Things look a little bit different when we look at the interviews that were conducted in predominantly Hispanic Latino neighborhoods. So we see a very different pattern here. Not to say that those things that we think about as planners were not important to many people, but we see the prioritization shift. So crime and safety become more important. We see elements, so sense of community, social interaction, social support, considerably more frequently mentioned in the Hispanic Latino context. And then when you look at destinations and upkeep and maintenance, one of the things that we realized is that people, when they did talk about these things, they were talking about them differently. They were talking about destinations in terms of knowing people who owned and operated stores, or a business that had been in the community for multiple generations and was thought of as sort of a community destination. Upkeep and maintenance was very clearly, we heard people talking about that in terms of their sense of neighborhood pride, in terms of the community coming together to address some of these things or struggling to do so. So again, just very different patterns that we see here. And here you can see kind of all the categories we came up with when we went through and coded these. The ones that are highlighted in red are the ones where we did see a difference between the Hispanic Latino and the non-Hispanic white neighborhoods. And I just will go through fairly quickly. I'm not going to read these, but I'll just let you glance at them as I go. But here, highlighting some of those social, and these are all quotations from the Hispanic Latino neighborhood context, because these were not mentioned very much at all in the comparison neighborhoods. So people talking about meeting friends, people talking about being Mexican, being Hispanic, being great to be out communicating while they're walking. We heard a lot of people talk about looking out for each other and being a neighborhood where people do look out for each other. So the sense of community and culture, people talking about their Mexican culture, connections, long-term connections to place, having family nearby. And then one of the other things that we saw was that characteristics that existing evidence, if we read all the research, tells us contribute to a walkable environment, may not do so consistently in different socioeconomic contexts. So we have building setbacks and enclosure, which the urban designers tell us this is what we need for a walkable neighborhood. And here you can see some pictures that are examples of that. We talked to people who said they were actually more comfortable walking in front of a lot with a big setback to a fast food restaurant because of the types of businesses that were located in the buildings that didn't have very much setback, or the doorways where homeless people might be, or because the building being right on the sidewalk, they felt like they were forced to walk closer to traffic, which was speeding by, and they pointed out that the cars were noisy and more polluting because they were not newer and nicer cars as you might see in a different neighborhood. Destinations, again, people viewed them differently. There were quite a few destinations that people talked about as being detractors in terms of walkability. They would still register as walk score, but these were places where people were congregating that the people we talked to did not want to be walking nearby. And then sidewalks. Sidewalks, of course, were viewed by many people in all the neighborhoods as being very important, and the lack of sidewalks being a detriment. But we also talked to a lot of people who didn't walk on sidewalks. They walked in the street because sidewalks tended to be blocked by parked cars, or blocked by gates that were left open, or sidewalks requiring that people walk closer to fences that may not be maintained with barking dogs. So lots of differences that, again, if we're not thinking on different levels of the social ecological model, we're going to be making some mistakes in terms of what we think is important to people. So in moving towards a conclusion, recognizing our own individual and societal bias and how we talk about and envision walkable communities, there's a great book that I would highly recommend, and I want to give you a couple quick quotes from this. So taste is a form of cultural capital that people acquire, often without knowing its origin. People from similar social and regional backgrounds develop common sensibilities and aesthetic appreciations. Shared taste is mobilized as the basis of group belonging and equally as the basis of social distinction or exclusion. Some images are widely shared. However, fine distinctions within the discourse are used to establish the status of some and to exclude others. So when we're talking about design, when we're talking about creating walkable neighborhoods, we really need to be aware of all of the meaning that is in the work that we're doing. So again, here's another quote from the book talking about these desired social identities and how landscape and our work can really influence that. So even if our jobs are mostly about the built environment, we must better understand how those elements interact with socioeconomic and sociocultural contexts. Where we're not directly involved in those other elements of that social ecological model, we need to be working on building partnerships so that we are not just understanding but actually working with others who can operate at those levels. Next steps for this research, we've just finished, like I mentioned, 500 interviews in California and Colorado. We're going to continue testing and refining as we move to St. Louis, Baltimore, and Phoenix in the fall. We're going to be creating focus groups and on-street interview protocols and trainings. And we're writing up this method that we've developed, and we really want to be sharing these tools with practitioners, with other researchers, with community organizations. We've been very impressed with the level of conversation that people are willing to have with us. We've talked to people with agencies in Tucson and elsewhere who are eager to be able to kind of follow on some of this work, to be able to engage on maybe other questions or expand to different parts of the city. So we are planning to be sharing these tools, and we've got a website that right now is sort of just a placeholder, but it is available, and you're able to sign up for updates there, so we'll notify you when those tools are available. And so this qualitative pedestrian environment database is something that we're hoping will be useful for all the people that I just mentioned. We'll have protocols for these interviews and focus groups and trainings. It's also a potential that it can become a repository for qualitative data. So one of the things that can make qualitative data difficult is that it is viewed as sometimes not being systematically collected, and it's not viewed as sort of being broad or representational enough to make decisions based on. And we're trying to, through the power of collaboration, to be able to start changing some of that thinking. So hopefully by early 2019, we'll be able to share those tools. And here's just a little image of the website, which I would encourage you all to visit. Again, you can sign up by just giving an email address, and you'll just be notified then when those tools are posted online. So with that, I think we've got some time for questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Arlie. Great presentation. For those viewing the webinar, please feel free to continue to submit your questions if you have them, but it does look like we have a few questions already, so I'll get started with those. So first, a couple questions specific to your study and Tucson specifically. So is there a trail plan system in Tucson? Are any trail friends groups active in these neighborhoods?
Yeah, good question. So there is quite a bit of work being done in some of these neighborhoods on trails. And so the trail system, there's a multi-purpose sort of bike ped path that runs along the river in Tucson, and I'm using air quotes because it's a river, but it never has any water in it because we're in Tucson. So yes, and that's been it came up in discussion quite a bit, is sort of the interface between the neighborhood and the trail system itself. The trail system is operated by the county, where most of the, obviously the city streets and whatnot are mostly operated and maintained by the city. So creating better connections between those two systems has been a topic of quite a bit of conversation, and definitely came up in our conversations as well. And this group that I mentioned, Living Streets Alliance, one of our partners there, they've definitely been active in those conversations. But beyond that, I'm not exactly sure what organizations are involved at the neighborhood level. Okay.
And then to build on that, were there any safe routes to school programs at schools in these 5 neighborhoods or in the Tucson School District?
Yes, there are. And one of the things that we are really proud of is that one of the neighborhoods where we did one of our first focus groups. So in the focus groups, we developed those with Living Streets Alliance, and they helped us to both recruit but also develop our approach based on some of the work that they've been doing. As part of that initial focus group, we were able to build some connections. Living Streets Alliance was then able to follow up with that by creating a new Safe Routes to School program at the elementary school in that neighborhood, and it's been a very, very successful one. So yes, so there's definitely Safe Routes to School involved, and definitely noted. We hear people talking about some of the programs that Safe Routes to School does.
Great. All right, and then I have 2 questions that are related, so I think I'll try to read them both to you, but then I can always repeat the second one about displacement. So how do you build walkable neighborhoods knowing walkable neighborhoods are correlated with advantaged neighborhoods and displacement? And then again, advantaged neighborhoods that aren't walkable don't want walkability because of barriers, and disadvantaged neighborhoods that aren't walkable don't want walkability because of displacement. So yes, again, getting to that displacement and walkability issues. And then this related question comes from somebody that works in the urban forestry, and they mentioned that they face similar challenges of tree planting in under-resourced communities, and that trees may trigger displacement. And so they're wondering if you have any suggestions or solutions to boost, urban canopy or walkability without the displacement.
Yeah, great questions. So I think, and this is, so the displacement question, I mean, it is the multi-million-dollar question, of course. And I think that from what we have seen, I think it's very important, and this is a not a policy initiative, not a big financing change, and all of those things are necessary. But what we're seeing is that it's really important that we don't assume that walkability looks and feels a certain way. And this doesn't mean that we're abandoning our expertise as transportation safety professionals or public health professionals, but it means that we really are trying to understand what is going to improve the lives of people living in a place, and that we're not just hung up on kind of this vision of walkability that checks all the boxes in terms of urban design. And so part of that is the outcome of what improvements occur in a place, and making sure that those are aligned with neighborhood priorities, or individual priorities even. But it's also in how we talk about things and how some of these issues are framed. And not that that's a silver bullet that's going to fix this issue, but we think that increasingly we are thinking that is a huge part of the puzzle here. And then, like I said, the other area of my research that I didn't get into today is that affordable housing piece, and making sure that we just have a fundamental belief that we cannot have a truly accessible, walkable, transit-friendly city if the neighborhoods that meet those criteria are only available to people making a certain income.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And then on the tree, so the tree question came up a lot. So part of it, and one of the recommendations we made to the city was to look at their maintenance requirements. So it's very dry in Tucson. There are trees that will survive in Tucson without additional water once they're established. But that establishment period can be quite taxing on individual homeowners if they're required to foot the bill for that water. But then like the questioner mentioned, then there are certain aesthetic assumptions about trees as well.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So and actually one more thing on that. So one of the interesting bits of history that came up was that there'd been a huge amount of urban renewal in the 1950s and 60s that really cleared a lot of traditionally Mexican neighborhoods of Tucson, and it was only about in the 1850s that Tucson, the part of Arizona where Tucson is, became part of the U.S. But in the 1930s and 40s, there was an effort to modernize these barrios, and one of the common sentiments at the time was that these efforts to modernize by putting in sidewalks and kind of normalizing the infrastructure was really to change the character of the neighborhoods and made them feel less like the places that people were familiar with. So some people point to that as kind of leading to eventually this urban renewal that just bulldozed vast swaths of the city.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, this question is related now to some of the data that you collected. Were there different attitudes in higher socioeconomic Hispanic neighborhoods or lower income non-Hispanic white neighborhoods?
That is a great question, and we it's really hard to pull apart, and that's one of the reasons we want to be doing this in more and different types of neighborhoods, because we were guilty in a way of one of the criticisms I made of some previous research, where we really were looking at a fairly narrow income band in terms of the neighborhood. But we do have one neighborhood where there's sort of more increasing incomes in the area, but we have not seen much of a pattern. But that's one of the reasons that we wanted to do this, replicate this in Los Angeles, because there we were able to look at a broader cross section of income types in neighborhoods with different racial and ethnic patterns.
All right, and did that neighborhood show any different data then that had them?
Well, we don't know yet. So the students just finished in LA last week.
Oh, okay.
So
Great.
we're going to be coding that over the summer and should know more by the fall.
Okay, great. And so this one is a question is specific to some infrastructure improvements. The listener asked specifically about pedestrian bridges usage, able to promote walkability, and then also if there are any other unique infrastructure improvements that might promote walkability.
Yeah, so pedestrian bridges, we've got a fair number of them in Tucson, and I think that the challenge with them is that they are often not very well used. I mean, I'm thinking of the sort of pedestrian bridge over an arterial to just get people across the street without getting hit by cars. Mm-hmm. And I think there's an issue with sort of the signal that those send to drivers, that pedestrians are not going to be in your way because they're going to be on one of these bridges, and then you do get pedestrians who, especially because it's hot and you don't want to, it's 114 degrees and you don't want to walk up a flight of stairs and then be, exposed as you walk over this metal bridge. So I think that there are some issues with those in all kinds of neighborhoods. So.
Mm-hmm. Great points. All right, and looks like we have time for one more question, so we'll end it with this question about some of your future research and when some of your research that you've described will be published, or if you have some published research that you can point to.
Yeah, so we have 2 papers that have been published on this work. And I was trying actually to share, I thought I could share them in the link, or the chat box, but it looks like I'm not able to do that. So I'll try to get those sent out, maybe Lisa with what you send out. But they're that Journal of the American Planning Association paper that's based on that systematic literature review we did that really got us started. And then we have a fairly recent publication in the Journal of Transport and Health that is based on the focus groups and looking at some of the sort of sociocultural influences on perceptions of neighborhood walkability. And right now we are very close to submitting a paper based on the Tucson interviews, these intercept interviews, where we're going to be able to we are making comparisons between the neighborhoods. So that bar chart that you saw, that will be in that paper. But we're hoping that will, get published at some point in the next year. But those things take time, unfortunately.
Yes. And I'm really excited for your website that you had mentioned, where there might be a repository of some tools and protocols and trainings.
Yeah, and hopefully, maybe it's definitely something that maybe NITC and TREC can help us get out there, because we really do think that these can be some useful tools. It sounds, like a pretty simple thing, going out and talking to people. But I've been amazed talking to different commuter organizations and different agencies just about how useful they think something like this could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, great. Well, thank you so much. And as Arlie mentioned, we will be sending out the slides and the video recording, so you'll have access to those resources that he had mentioned. But with that, this concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks again to Arlie for sharing his work. You can view other professional development offerings on our website, along with our Transportation and Communities Workshop Academy, as I mentioned, with registration opening next week. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.